Setting up the meeting for live.
You ready to go? I'm going to
Yes, you are live now.
Yes. All right, just wanted to confirm. Welcome everybody. My name is Adriana Parker and I'm a librarian at the Marriott Library at the University of Utah. Before we begin, I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and the organization that they're affiliated with. So we can do like a raise of hands and I'll call on folks. How does that sound? All right. And I will kind of off and on mute and unmute myself throughout the discussion. All right, so beginning with Joy.
Hi everyone, my name is Joy Kavapalu. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am with Decarcerate Utah.
All right, Rebecca.
Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca. I use the pronoun she or they. I'm a student at the University of Utah getting my PhD in math, and I am with Unsafe.
And Josh.
Hi everyone, my name is Josh Newbury. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the interim clinical director for the University of Utah Counseling Center.
All right, Sai.
Hi everyone, my name is Sai. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm with Decarcerate Utah.
And Colt.
Hello, my name is Colt Robbins. I use they, them, theirs pronouns, and I'm also with Decarcerate Utah.
Tayler.
Hi everyone, I'm Tayler Bseiso. I use she, they, and I'm from the Center for Student Wellness as a peer health educator and also the Center for Violence Prevention.
Next, we have Ellie.
Hi everyone, I'm Ellie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the Center for Student Wellness and I manage our Victim Survivor Advocacy Program.
And last but not least, Devon.
Hi, I'm Devon Cantwell. I use she, her pronouns, and I am part of Unsafe.
Thanks, everybody. So now we'll begin with the first question. And if we could maybe go in just the order of like hand raises again, maybe that would work best. First question, how is public safety defined in our community and who defines it? Tayler, go right ahead.
I think that safety is kind of defined by each culture for themselves. I think here at the U as a student, I would define safety as the security of knowing that when I go out in public or even in the safety of my own home, that I am both like physically and mentally safe, and that if there was something to occur, that there is a system in place to restore that security.
Other thoughts? Go right ahead, Rebecca.
I think this question is really interesting because there's a few different ways that we can view it. When I first read this question, I started thinking about the ideally what safety is and then versus the reality of what safety looks like. So what safety looks like is being defined by people who are in positions of power or who are not affected by safety issues. That's when we start to have, I think, a lot of the problems that students experience, or we get that lack of feeling of safety. And I think the reality on our campus and our community is that safety is defined by those people in power, so the administration, our police department, the public safety office. And if I could throw in there, I think it should instead be defined by those who have been systemically not in positions of power, meaning the students from groups who are being most harmed by safety issues.
Thank you. Let's move on to question 2, if that's okay. How can we, as a community, create systems of safety that center those who have been most harmed? Go ahead, Ellie.
I think we should start by redefining safety. As Rebecca spoke to, I think we have the ideal of what safety is, access and entitlement to space to live our lives and be well and move about. But to actually redefine safety by recognizing and acknowledging and repairing harm that's been done. And then listening to what people need and they want in order to feel safe, and allowing our communities to define what safety is, and then shifting into that paradigm from kind of upholding property and power as the definition of safety, and more into a humanistic definition of what safety is, and allowing folks to define that for themselves and then have that move upwards to where power is held.
All right, the next question, unless anybody else would like to speak on that one. Tayler, go right ahead.
I super loved what Ellie said. I think the only thing that I would want to emphasize is that in order to kind of redefine and build a community around safety, we would have to not only like give an audience to people to talk about what safety means to them and how they've been affected, but also put value to what they're saying. I think that there are really good outlets for people to talk, but there's not a lot of respect around them or a lot of promotion around them. And so I think that's a really good first step.
All right, next question. What would this reasonably look like at the University of Utah? What would transitioning to a model that's less dependent on law enforcement possibly entail? Devon, please go. That sounded like sorry, Devon. It sounded like I was, oh, Devon, please go. I mean, you can go ahead and reply.
No, you're fine. So I think this comes down to a couple of things. First, I actually think that the Division of Community Services that's just been newly created under the Department of Public Safety is a really good step in kind of the right direction with this, partially because it's imagining folks responding to calls who are not necessarily law enforcement officers, but people who specialize in handling those types of crises, and are centering the person first, instead of just trying to like fight like a violent situation or something harmful that's happening with like another form of violence. And one of the things that I think is really necessary though is continually working towards the goal of abolition with that. So if you're just creating something that's like police plus, you're always going to end up having police and law enforcement being the center of that. So I think it's important whenever we start looking at these alternatives to also say, like, how can this get us further away from having to center law enforcement in these types of responses? I think one thing that's also really critical to keep in mind with this as well is the fact that these things all require resources, whether that is time, financial, infrastructure. One of the big things that I know we've been running into issues with as we've talked with the Salt Lake City Council has been the city is literally not sure what infrastructure would look like for this. We do have some places like Portland, sorry, excited dogs. We do have some places like Portland where they are, they've been deploying folks for specifically mental health calls. They've been deploying like crisis counselors without law enforcement. And they've had a lot of success with that model. And there's other places that are starting to do this, but I think it shows the fact though that you need like a properly staffed department for that has training and support. You can't be burning people out with this. And you also have to plan like long-term infrastructure wise. You can't just hire one person and hope that that's gonna be like your law enforcement alternative. It really has to be a collaborative effort. And I also think there has to be information sharing with that too, right? So it would be great if places that are trying out alternatives are actually collaboratively sharing this information with each other so we can share best practices and continue to build on alternative models to law enforcement. So that was a lot of things, but hopefully those are helpful.
That was great. Other comments? Okay. What are some non-punitive ways to address and respond I can repeat the question. What are some non-punitive ways to address and respond to harm? Tayler.
I know it's kind of the field that I'm in, but I just want to talk to like the extent that in which education helps with, like bettering our community. I know that like personally, and also just with some of the peers that I've worked with, there's a lot of times where maybe people are causing harm, but they honestly just don't know. And, that is very unfortunate, but at the same time, just socially, sometimes people are raised not to be as aware of, the effects of some of the things that they say or do. So I just want to like say that education in the form of, and it coming from a caring way, or a caring and focusing on just betterment, has like just amazing effects on people. Kind of a personal situation or example of that is when I first introduced my mom to my first girlfriend, her first comment was, "So who's the man and who's the woman? There always is one, like Ellen and Portia." And I think, looking back on it, I think it's kind of funny, but when it first happens, there's that shock. And since then, there's been a lot of conversations, a lot of education, a lot of even just personal interactions, and she's come miles from that.
I'll just give you all a second in case you want to jump in. Okay, moving on. Which resources would you recommend to a person who is experiencing or has experienced sexual harassment, sexual assault, stalking, abuse, or other gendered violence, including anti-LGBTQIA violence, that don't involve engaging with law enforcement?
Hi, I can talk. So I think this is kind of a hard question because, to be honest, there's not a lot of great resources out there, especially because when you look at it, a lot of our domestic violence centers in Utah do actively work with law enforcement, and access to services often requires documentation or paperwork. So that's a huge barrier. And then it's also, when you're talking about these things, it's important that we're not like pushing the problem around. So if people are experiencing harm that from like police officers and we don't want to go to police officers, we're not just pushing them into an equally racist or ableist system like hospitals, which also perpetuate lots of harm. So I think it's like really important that when we're looking at resources, that people's problems are being pushed around to other institutions that are also being heavily policed and are meant to protect whiteness.
Tayler.
I think that this question kind of comes in two parts. We're all very involved on campus, and I think that campus itself is starting to have some really great resources. Friends that I know who have disclosed, sexual violence or just interpersonal violence, I always send them to Ellie, the victim survivor advocates. I think that they do a phenomenal job on campus. But as far as outside of campus, I completely agree with Colt. I think that it's really hard to find these resources, let alone get access to them. And I know that Ellie sent an email out yesterday giving some great hotlines that you can call, but as far as in-person IRL, I think that the Rape Recovery Center is really awesome. I have a lot of friends that volunteer there, as well as specifically for LGBTQ+. The Pride Center has counselors there that can help work with you.
Devon?
Yeah, so I think this was also a difficult question. Rebecca and I were kind of chatting before this and trying to figure out, okay, like where would we send people? And, this is actually something that's come up and been a big thing for our organization to grapple with over the past year, because we have had, multiple folks reach out and say, I've gone to X resource that hasn't been a safe place, or I've gone to law enforcement that hasn't been a safe place. And so Aside from the Center for Student Wellness and the victim survivor advocates there that I think have been really helpful, we've tried to think about like what exactly about that experience has been a helpful thing for victims and survivors who have handled those situations. I think part of it is being able to be given a menu of options and really helping. So I think our default is we often send folks to community resources that will give folks experiencing that type of violence a menu of options and not just push them to one thing. I think that's one thing that's can be particularly harmful sometimes about our knee-jerk response to involve law enforcement in gender-based violence, because I do think oftentimes that can limit the potential options and really narrows what folks think about in terms of how they can get justice in that situation or how they can become safe in that situation. A couple of things that we've come up with. So aside from the Rape Recovery Center, I know that they're the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, UCASA, and I think a lot of this too, the caveat and like the asterisk on this is oftentimes there's particular people in these organizations that can be more helpful than others. And I think this is one of the ways too where reaching out to community orgs that may partner with some of these folks can be helpful, just because, especially if you're somebody that's like, look, I don't want to get law enforcement involved with this, but I do want to be safe. I think reaching out to some community orgs, sometimes they can refer you to like particular people to reach out to or give you particular names. I know that we've, and again too, I think this becomes tricky because I think even the non-law enforcement specific options, I think still do have a lot of connections to like the carceral and legal systems as a whole. You know, I know like the Utah Victims Legal Clinic has been really helpful for helping folks navigate like the online portals and things like that for getting stalking, like civil stalking injunctions. And surprisingly, Utah has built a fairly robust online resource system. In general too, the last thing I would say is like, I think seeking out some of the online safety planning resources can be really useful, because oftentimes some of the things that can help provide you safety or make you feel safe are some of those, like a lot of the online guides that are available now, especially ones that have come up in the recent months with COVID and kind of a lack of in-person or, you know, in real life access to those things. Some of those resources I think have been fairly helpful for at least like thinking through like small, simple things, as well as like some alternatives to, you know, carceral or legal solutions to help kind of pursue safety on that. A small like tech-based app that we've had some luck referring folks to that are kind of not sure what next steps to pursue when they're helping folks in these situations has been it's an app called My Plan, and you can actually kind of input information on it about like the situation that you're handling or that a friend may be handling. It actually uses some stuff from things like the lethality assessment protocol and some other types of lethality measures to help kind of assess like how urgent that situation might be. And you can also input things like, you know, in terms of like concerns you may have about your relationship with that person that you're trying to help or whatnot. So again, none of these things are, you know, for lack of a better word, like a silver bullet on this, but I think the big thing to keep in mind is like, where can you send people that will give them options and agency and choice?
Hi, I have another thought on that as well. I think we have an amazing community here. We have networks of our friends and our loved ones. I think offering to be a safe person to those in your community and your networks to explore the options and resources that you know about to get folks like connected to resources. I think the community is a place to really brainstorm and kind of get the love and support, and then again, like those options and connections that you might need. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like a formal organization, but we have these, you know, communities among ourselves, even if it's like your, you know, Facebook friends or something, I don't know. But I think, you know, remembering that we have these people in our lives, you know, hopefully that are safe and healthy, that we can reach out to our peers to just talk through what are the options, what have you been through, you know, what worked for you in the past in a similar situation or things like that. So we have mutual aid among ourselves.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question, if that's cool with everybody. Okay. We have repeatedly seen disability and health issues, including visible or audible symptoms, mental or physical health emergencies / outbursts, perceived addiction, etc., criminalized in our country and responded to with police violence. What or who are some health-based resources in our community and on campus that exist to support folks in crisis? Beginning with you all.
Again, I really think, first of all, it's important that we talk about where this criminalization comes from and how this criminalization actually seeks to exclude people with disabilities from coming into college campuses, because we know that the school to prison pipeline targets students with disabilities heavily, and that students with disabilities are much more likely to be referred to police officers or receive disciplinary measures. And so when we talk about like policing around and violence against people with disabilities, this happens as early as like the age of 3, you know? So I think that's really important that we're talking about like that these things are like also actively exploiting people and not allowing them to even come to our college campus.
Do you have a recommended series of questions someone should ask themselves if they find themselves in a distressing situation where they're deliberating calling the police or another resource?
I think one of the first questions you should ask yourself is what identities are present in the moment. I know that the Center for Student Wellness or the peer health educators do a presentation called Bystander Intervention. And that's something that we tell everybody about before you call the police. Look at the identities present and understand the history behind that, how those identities interact with police, or how police interact, specifically more how police interact with those identities. You know, if there is a person of color present, it's important to remember that a lot of times that will escalate it. That will, even if they maybe aren't necessarily the perpetrator of harm, just them being there could cause them to be hurt physically, mentally, or incarcerated. The next thing I think to do is to kind of understand that, or question if this is a situation that can be de-escalated and what resources that you know focus specifically on that.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
In terms of like lists of questions, I think some things that are really good to keep in mind is like, what is your goal in seeking help? So primarily like, what is your goal for your safety, for this other person's safety who maybe is a person in distress or whoever they are? What is your goal for safety for the people around you? What do I think police could do here that I can't do myself or with the group of people that I'm with? Can someone else do that thing? Is there some resource that I am aware of and have access to that I can call? And is someone else available? I think the last one is really critical. And again, like gets into this conversation of our community resources having proper funding and having proper staffing. For example, I had a personal situation earlier this year where I had a friend who was in severe mental distress. We found them downtown, and when we found them, the security at the mall were trying to call the police, and we were able to make sure that they didn't do that, and called the nonviolence team to come out and help us with that situation, since they have expertise with mental health issues and mental distress that the cops just plainly don't have the same training on, and neither should they really be responsible for those situations. One thing I knew is that if it had been on a Sunday or a Saturday, if I had tried and called at a specific time, those folks would not have been able to come out. In fact, I think I had to wait about an hour until I could actually talk to somebody because they weren't able to be staffed until about 10 a.m. or something, whenever that was happening. So those are good things to keep in mind, because it might be a time when you're actually not able to call anyone else. And so depending on the urgency of the situation, you have to weigh those things out. Another thing, going back to something I said earlier, is just noting who is around you. So if you're a white person like myself and I call the cops, and there's like a group of Black young kids there who aren't even involved in the situation, but are maybe trying to help or whatever, those people are, or maybe they're even the victims of this distressing situation, those folks are more likely to be harmed by police intervention than I am, or the perpetrator even, in a lot of instances. And so there's really a holistic approach that you have to take with these questions, and not just considering the immediate need to call someone right away and thinking that's the cops, and instead stepping back and trying to take that perspective of, okay, what is my situation? What am I trying to do? Who actually could I call? And do I need to call the police?
All right, moving on. This is related to alternatives to calling the police. A slight shift in perspective, though. I was wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about the distinction between defunding the police versus abolishing the police, and your perspectives on that, or your organization's perspectives on that. Rebecca?
I want to give other people space, but I'll just say, so defunding the police is really about redistributing funds from the police to resources that are desperately in need of more funding. And abolishing, from my perspective, is more about re-envisioning safety within our community, and turning the power of protecting and serving our community to that community itself, rather than relying on a militarized system, which often intimidates and harms that community, rather than the former. And personally, I'll just say, I feel that defunding is a tool that we use as we move towards abolition. I also believe that abolition is a much more holistic and encompassing conversation than just stating, let's just get rid of the cops. When we're talking about abolition, we're really discussing a much larger conversation about the militarization of our communities and incarceration of our friends and our neighbors. We're talking about surveillance technologies and how those are used as weapons against especially people of color. We're talking about reinventing what we think of when we talk about justice and reworking of our justice system. We're talking about decriminalizing survival and freeing people from involuntary confinement, working only with alternatives to prison, which are not carceral in nature. We're talking about community self-governance and assessing what our communities and our people actually need through the voices and the experiences of those same community members. We're talking about safe and affordable housing, and putting an end to homelessness. And we're talking about land acknowledgements and the restoration of autonomy to communities who have had that stripped by the original and modern day colonizers. So this conversation that we're having is really about how we envision safety on a complete societal level. So yes, in the context of cops, but also in the context of how we structure power at all levels.
I think when looking at police in general and what we plan to do in the future, it's really important to look at the past and understand that the original police or prison system and policing system in America was made to re-enslave Black Americans. And I think that that shows a lot of, or that kind of trend still shows through today, whether that be consciously or unconsciously. There's a lot of prejudices in the system itself. I think it's also important to look at today how kind of training goes for police officers. I actually looked up the number of hours of training for a police officer specifically in Utah, and they only need 832 hours of training before kind of going into action, whereas a hairdresser in Utah needs at least 2,000 hours before even being able to enter a salon as a professional. And so I think that kind of understanding that maybe when we're talking about defunding, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be stripping away all these resources from police, but rather redefining how it's going to be used, maybe putting more money towards training than riot gear, things like that.
Aside from what Tayler said, I actually don't think it's important that there's more training go to police at all. There's not evidence that any type of more training reduces the harm that police inflict upon communities. So it's important that no more resources are given. So for example, body cams are always heralded as being amazing resources for police too. To reduce harm, but there's no evidence that body cams do anything to reduce harm. And there's actually studies that show body cams incite more violence against people that the police are arresting. So it really comes down to not giving any more funding at all to police, but doing that over a sustainable time period.
How about at this point, we have some time left. I'm wondering if y'all would mind discussing what your organizations do and resources that folks may not be aware of your organization providing access to. We'll be collecting a list of resources and sharing them on our social media, the library's social media. And so feel free to contribute links into the chat, or even we can share screens, stuff like that.
Yeah, so Decarcerate Utah actually, I think about a month ago, they did a webinar on what to do instead of calling the police. And as well as a lot of the things that we talked about in here, they talk about just kind of the formation of different groups of people and community leverage justice that ensures help for people when they're in crisis. And it also helps in the prevention too of people going into traumatic situations. So the link that I dropped in is a link to a webinar about that, and then also some resources and articles.
Great, thank you.
If I can share my screen, I can go through a list of alternatives to law enforcement that the Center for Student Wellness provides to our clients and to the community. Am I allowed to do that? Can you make me a co-host? I'd be happy to share that. In the meantime, there's also a really great book called Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. That's a really great compilation of different areas. There is actually a chapter 14, that says maybe you don't have to call 911. I found this really helpful. It talks a lot about, just different options in terms of medical response, in terms of community response, in terms of crisis intervention and things like that. So I recommend the book, especially that chapter. And it looks like I'm a co-host now, so I'm going to share my screen and I can just go through these resources. And for some reason, my computer opens things in Internet Explorer, so I hope you can see this okay. Can everyone see this okay? Okay, so we have this broken down into some different areas. The first one is sexual assault related resources. So obviously the Rape Recovery Center, which has been mentioned a few different times, is a confidential service. So you can call and explore options through their crisis line. So, you know, crisis in the moment, and then also some long-term resources around healing. And also things like hospital response services if folks do choose to go to the emergency room after being sexually assaulted. The Family Justice Center also has some great resources. They have a 24/7 hotline that you can call that will get you connected to different resources, but they also have a physical space that you can walk into for lots of different things. DWS and DCF, I mean, there's all sorts of different partners there to address different areas of folks' situations, but they do also have sexual assault and strangulation nurse exams. So if you're not as comfortable going to the emergency room, that is a place that you can go. There's some stalking resources. There's a hotline that you can call, again, for support, crisis counseling, to help talk through safety plans. And then also the stalkingawareness.org has, I think Devon mentioned this, but they have a free safety planning guide that's really helpful to just kind of look through and apply it to your own situation. You know, we shouldn't have to always go to someone or call somebody. Sometimes we can find the resources within ourselves to kind of plan through and anticipate what might happen and make a plan for how that turns out. And then finally, we have a section on domestic and dating violence. So I think someone mentioned the domestic violence link line. It's another place you can call 24/7 and explore options, seek support and resources. We have worked with the Strong Hearts Native Helpline, which is really great. It's free and confidential also, and it's specifically for Indigenous American Indian, Alaska Native communities. They're not 24/7, but it's a really fabulous helpline. And then also loveisrespect.org has a helpline and a text line for referrals, safety planning, all of that. And some of these services are available in multiple languages. So I'm not sure how we could get this out, but we might post it on our website or something. But I'm happy, if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to email it or anything like that. So
if you want to share the link in our chat, we can then share that in the Facebook comments. Go right ahead, Devon.
I also echo Rebecca's comments about the Decarcerate resources are just so thorough and so helpful. I'd say that those are probably the bulk of the type of like practical, like everyday use resources that we point folks to. But I did want to take a quick minute. One of the things that Ellie had brought up earlier in this conversation was kind of the need for engaging in this type of work, to finding alternatives to law enforcement. And ultimately, at least in our kind of philosophical view, for us to be able to move forward to an abolition framework, it requires us building trust within each other and building strong community networks. One of the things that we have tried to do and was kind of a, I guess, impetus for us starting this Instagram page and organization to begin with was providing students a space, and students in particular, an outlet to kind of talk about process, you know, basically like what they had gone through, how they were processing safety events on campus. We've gotten probably a number of folks that have just been like, this just feels good to know that there's like others out there, and that like I am not by myself or processing this. And a lot of folks that we've kind of encountered have said, you know, we found resources, or, you know, we're in a good spot now, but like, you know, this has just been a healing thing. So I would say like we're out there for folks who just like kind of want to be in a place with other victims or survivors who have kind of undergone issues or things like this. And I think a lot of folks have found kind of some comfort of that. But of course, everyone has different ways of processing these things. The other thing that I'd say that we've been trying to do is, as we alluded to before, abolition's like a long game. I think Colt brought up a really good point earlier that like we have to make these transitions in sustainable ways. And so one of the things that we've undertaken as kind of a longer term project is really trying to think about all of these different both policy and organizational areas where we can kind of bolster to start creating more sustainable infrastructure that's not law enforcement or carceral. So for example, a really simple example we're working on right now is actually like reducing our reliance on UPD for folks who don't feel safe walking on campus at night. Right now, you know, it's a number that you call and police come and walk with you. We've heard from a lot of BIPOC and LGBT students on campus. They don't feel comfortable calling that number. And so they've already been calling friends to, you know, come meet them at their car and walk with them so they're not walking by themselves, but they don't feel comfortable calling UPD. I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where they feel comfortable calling UPD, and nor should they. And I also just don't think it's, my personal view on this is that not sure it's like the best use of our like time, resources, money. But what a lot of other campuses have done is they've set up really sustainable and successful programs where they've had basically students that, you know, come do walking services, or they'll come like, you know, they'll drive like a, you know, a safe van or something like that. And so they've been alternatives to this police escort program, but actually having a student escort program. And they've got a lot of, you know, things to like just verify that folks aren't, you know, using that position to, you know, abuse folks or whatnot. So there's a lot of checks and things on this. And a lot of those things have been developed by the community themselves or by sharing, again, this piece of sharing information and best practices across campus and across communities. You know, there's a lot of communities that are trying to do this work in different places. And so I think it's important for us to share that knowledge as we get it. But so I just wanted to throw that piece out there because I think that's one example of like, by shifting the way that we're like framing having those conversations, like we've put together a brief, we put together a funding proposal for this. We're trying to do some work on like shifting some resources that way and revamping that program in a different way. So it's not involving law enforcement at all, but still serves the purpose of like what students want that type of program to serve, which is just being able to feel safe walking around at night. So so that being said, if anyone is kind of interested in, you know, if you're looking around, you're saying, I think this thing would be really helpful for students, or this thing currently involves law enforcement and we don't really have a good alternative for it right now. We're kind of hoping, you know, we'd love to work with you on any type of like drafting those types of policy and infrastructure plans. And we're trying to do a lot of work on kind of like that micro level of like pushing resources in different directions, or rethinking how we're solving some of these problems on our campus. So.
So just to check in with y'all, there are a few folks we haven't heard from yet, Joy, Sai, and Josh. So I wanted to make sure that we give you an opportunity to speak if you'd like. If not, no pressure. Or if there are panelists who have questions for each other about your organizations, potential partnerships, things along those lines.
Yeah, I was just going to point to the mobile crisis outreach team operated through Uni, not as a perfect solution, but an alternative to calling the police, especially when there's a mental health crisis of some kind. So their number is 1-800-273-8255. I definitely hear and echo those same concerns about how we staff these resources. And I really kind of heard kind of mixed things about this particular resource. Really helpful. They're intended as an alternative to hospitalizing individuals who have mental health concerns. Some folks have said that it's been really helpful. They can travel to different areas in the Valley as well. But I want to be careful about how I talk about that as a resource and not overstate how helpful that it may be, but it is an alternative that's out there.
I also wanted to add that Colt, Joy, and I are starting this new organization called Students for Decarceration. And it's a chapter of Decarcerate Utah where we specifically focus on students at the U. and like educating and mobilizing students around like abolishing prison and police. And we are still working on like the details of the first meeting, but we're hoping to gain a little bit more of a following, and students who are interested can, I'll drop the link to the Instagram in the chat, but students who are interested can follow us on Instagram and we'll post more information.
All right, one last check-in. I think we're probably all set then. I just wanted to thank everybody for participating and for sharing your knowledge with us, your expertise, your experience. We really value this opportunity to share that with not only our library users, but the greater community. So thanks again for all of your support and your time, and we'll see you soon. Be safe.